Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to this latest installment in the webinar series hosted by the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities at APLU, or better known as USU. My name is Jennifer Coip, and I'm the Executive Director of USU and the Vice President of Urban Initiatives at APLU. I'm happy to see you all and especially want to acknowledge our partner at the Urban Institute and our primary presenter in this webinar, Brian Cook, who is the Director of Higher Education Policy at the Urban Institute. As many of you know, the Urban Institute is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit research organization, and they conduct independent research on a wide range of social economic issues that are focused primarily to improve the quality of life in urban areas and promote upward mobility and equity. And this is very much in line with the mission and goals and activities of the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities. Their organization aims to provide data and evidence to inform decision making and to create inclusive economic growth. So both as the leader of USU as well as a self-proclaimed data nerd, I'm very excited about partnering with these colleagues. I want to focus on our primary presenter, Brian Cook, whose primary contributions to the organization are in the Work, Education, and Labor Division of the Urban Institute. And he's here today to discuss the goals and preliminary findings from a study that explores the future of college admissions, which the Urban Institute is conducting in partnership with the Association of Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, or UERU, a frequent partner of USU, and the Center for Enrollment Research, Policy, and Practice at the University of Southern California Rossier School of Education. The project itself is exploring trends in admission across some key events that have happened in a relatively short historic period of time. And these include ones they're very familiar with: legislative actions, Supreme Court decisions, policy changes and practice changes to financial aid, and of course, large social events like COVID-19. And these all have had implications for who applies to college and universities and who's admitted, which is, of course, the foundation for student success, college completion, employment, and social mobility. So if we're able to discuss these issues and talk about how recent historical events, are impacting the current and future vision for who our students are, who's in the room, and therefore who gets to graduate from college, it's really key to understanding a larger picture. So I'm really excited to learn with all of you, and therefore, without further ado, I want to turn this over to Brian. Brian, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the opportunity to speak today. And as you just mentioned, again, for everyone and anyone who may have joined late, I'm Brian Cook. I head up higher education policy research at the Urban Institute. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Jason Cohn, who's a research associate at Urban, as well as Julia Michaels, who is the Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships at UERU, who, as Jennifer mentioned, is one of our partners. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that both Julia and myself are former APLU staff. So we are very familiar with USU and the good work that is done there. And so, as Jennifer mentioned, I'm here today to talk to you about a project that Urban has been leading for about the past year and a half, titled Exploring the Future of College Admissions. Specifically, we'll provide an overview of the project, share some of the preliminary findings, and provide an update on some of the next steps of the project. Next slide. And as Jennifer mentioned, we have several partners. She mentioned UERU and Julia, who have been instrumental in promoting the project among their membership and helping to get schools to participate in the project. Julie Passault is our lead at CERPP out at USC. They've been a great analytical partner, and they're actually leading some work that I'll talk about a little more later that's exploring changes in schools' admissions policies and practices. And then finally, Christine Keller and the Association for Institutional Research have worked with us from the outset of the project to ensure that the data that we're requesting from schools are data that schools can in fact provide, and that we minimize to the extent possible burden to the IR offices, who often are tasked with providing a lot of this data. Next slide. I also want to acknowledge the funders for this body of work. Both the Kresge Foundation and Mellon Foundation have really been supporters of this project from the outset. So we could not do this without them. Next slide. So as Jennifer alluded to, the origin of this project was to really try to understand the impact of the 2023 Supreme Court ruling that all but eliminated race from consideration in the college admissions process, and what that decision, the impact it would have on the demographics of those who apply to, get admitted to, and ultimately enroll in college. However, as we were beginning to put the project together and roll it out, there were two additional events that were occurring at the same time that had the potential to impact college admissions just as much, if not more, than the Supreme Court ruling. The problematic rollout of the new simplified FAFSA form, and the growing number of states, university systems, and individual institutions that were beginning to eliminate DEI activity and programs and offices. Because we recognized it would be impossible to tease out the impact of each of these events on the demographic profile of applicants, admits, and enrollees, we essentially changed the focus of the project from primarily exploring the impact of the Supreme Court decision to looking more broadly at the confluence of all of these events on the 2023-24 admission cycle. Next slide. Now, the way we designed the project to explore the impact of these events is through a three-part design. So the first part is working directly with colleges and universities to collect demographic data on applicants, admits, and enrollees from 2018 through 2024 initially, and we're now expanding that to 2025 to collect the current admissions data. But the goal of that is to identify historical trends prior to 2024. Our ultimate goal is to see how trends may differ by things such as sector, across different regions of the country, as well as looking at how states that have previously had affirmative action bans compare to other states who are experiencing this for the first time as a result of the Supreme Court ruling. The second part is to understand how colleges and universities have been modifying their admissions policies and practices leading up to and in response to the events of 2023. And that is an area of research that CERPP out at USC is working with the National Association of College Admissions Counseling, or NACAC, to develop and administer a survey on this. And then the third part is ultimately to convene admissions practitioners and researchers to discuss the implications of the project's findings on the future of college admissions. And so it's important for me to note that all participating schools in this project are provided anonymity. So at no point do we disclose who is participating in the project through publications or in presentations. There are a set of schools who are participating in the project that, while maintaining their anonymity, have given us permission to share their participation for the purposes of recruiting. So in events like this. So those schools are the University of Southern California, American University, Washington State University, and the University of Minnesota are just some of the schools who have begun participating in this project. Next slide. Now, the need for a project such as this is really due to the fact that existing publicly available data on college admissions is severely limited. All of us are familiar with IPEDS data and the fact that it's the gold standard for institutional level data on enrollment. But one of the big challenges with IPEDS data is there are delays in when the data is actually released, and it's not most timely. So what that means is that the data for the 2024 entering class would likely not be available until the earliest, late 2025, possibly early to mid 2026. Now, even if IPEDS data were able to release the data in a more timely manner, one of the other challenges is it does not collect demographic data on applicants, admits, and entering first-year students beyond gender. So we would know about any changes in gender, but we wouldn't know anything about race, ethnicity, income, academic preparation, any of that. Now, IPEDS is in fact scheduled to begin collecting race ethnicity as part of its admission survey beginning this fall with the 2025 survey. However, given the mass layoffs at the Institute of Education Science and the National Center for Education Statistics, it is unclear as to whether or not this new collection will happen. And even if it does, the data that will be collected will only be for the 2025-26 academic year and forward, which means that we won't be able to really research how these events that we've just discussed are impacting the demographics of who's applying, getting admitted, and enrolling in institutions. Because only thing that will be collected is for this coming year and going forward. There will be no retroactive data collection. And then finally, there's very little systemic data on admissions policies and practices, and none that indicate how any of these policies and practices have begun to change in recent years and how those changes might be impacting some of the demographic shifts that we might see in the applicant, admit, and enrollee data. All right, next slide. So all of this is a description of the project before the 2024 election. Obviously, since January 20th, the political climate and the challenges facing higher education have drastically changed. And with the climate and changes come additional impacts on admissions and the data needed to assess these impacts. So for one, we've seen cancellation of NIH and NSF grants and contracts causing significant hiring freezes and layoffs that impact universities broadly. We've, of course, seen executive orders that are threatening institutions' access to federal funds if certain policies regarding perceived anti-Semitic behavior on campus and DEI practices are not changed. There's also the potential for a travel ban that could impact enrollment of international students. And of course, the layoffs at the Department of Education have the potential to create another round of delays and issues with this year's FAFSA reform. So when you think about these and other pending actions at both federal and state levels, there's a significant potential for undergraduate admissions to be impacted in negative ways. Compounding all of this potential change is the reduction in force among the Department of Education staff at IES and NCS I mentioned earlier, that could result in significant loss of public access to valuable federal data that could help us understand these changes. Now, nothing has been indicated so far to suggest that we're going to lose access to iPads or any of the other federal data at the Department of Education. However, given what we've seen, that is not entirely clear, and there is no statutory requirement for iPads data to be made available to the public. So even if it is collected, there's no guarantee that that data will be made public. So what data will continue to be collected, what will be the quality of any future data collected, and what data will be made available to the public are all valid questions as we go forward. So all of this just underscores the importance of this research practice partnership that is essentially working to collect key data to understand how admissions patterns have been changing since 2018. Now, when we launched this project back in late 2023, early 2024, we received interest from anywhere between 30 to 40 institutions. And through our first wave of data collection, which ended December 30th of 2024, we had 17 institutions that submitted data. We had an 18th that submitted data after we had already begun our preliminary analysis. And we've continued to recruit and work with schools to collect data. And just as evidence of the fact that despite everything that's happened since January 20th, there's still a lot of interest in the project. Since then, we've continued to receive interest from a number of schools, including some highly selective privates, suggesting that, again, despite everything that has been going on over the past several months, there are a lot of schools that believe this work is important and really want to participate. So that is a general overview of sort of the project and what we're hoping to accomplish, and some of the rationale behind it. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jason Cohn, who is leading the data analysis for this, to share some of the preliminary findings from the project. Now, I will point out that our original plan for dissemination was to publish some of the data that you're about to see in a short brief. But given some of the scrutiny that higher education's been facing, Urban made the decision to sort of pause on releasing that data at that time. And so the information that you're about to see, we've already written up a publication that we hope to release in the near future, but this will be the first time that we've shared it outside of the schools who are participating in the project. And that just goes to underscore that as part of this project, we really value the institutional data privacy and the anonymity that schools want. So we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we protect every institution who participates in this project. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jason to share some of what we have begun to learn from the data that we've collected.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I'm excited to go ahead and be able to share some of these preliminary results we have. I want to warn a little bit that this is kind of showing what kinds of analyses we're interested in doing and kind of the interesting findings we can get from these data. Our sample is still relatively small, so we really just want to reiterate the importance of having several institutions participate in this sort of study so that we can get a more representative overview of what's going on across the country and disaggregate by more characteristics and things like that. So for the next few minutes, I'm just going to go through some of the research questions that are framing our analysis, talk a little bit about the sample and methods we're working with, and then we're going to go look through different racial and ethnic groups and see what's happening with their admission cycles. So for the research questions, we're overall looking at how the racial and ethnic diversity of the applicant pool compares to that of admitted students and enrolled students, and how those have changed over time. So we are looking back to 2018 because we want to be able to get a fairly consistent trend ahead of these anti-DEI legislation and Supreme Court decision on affirmative action and FAFSA rollouts and all these things that Brian talked about earlier. And we also want to sort of get a picture of what admissions were looking like pre-COVID. And then within racial and ethnic groups, we want to look at how gender breakdowns have changed over time and whether these things have had a potential impact on that. And also how do these trends differ for the more or less selective institutions, so we can get a sense of not just the overall picture, but how these things are affecting schools in different ways. So if we look at the sample, we have 17 research universities in our sample so far for this preliminary analysis. As Brian said, got a few more to add on the next wave. But these are mostly public schools, but with 4 private universities included in there. And 6 of these schools are in our more selective category where their acceptance rates were below 50% in 2023. 4 of these schools in our sample were subject to a ban on affirmative action before 2023 because of a state level decision. We are not yet doing subgroup analysis for those schools, but would love to get a larger sample and be able to see potentially how those states might have been affected differently by the affirmative action case in the Supreme Court. So our data consists of first-year applicants, admits, and enrollee counts by race and ethnicity from 2018 to 2024. This is a total of 3.9 million applicants across these years at these 17 schools, and 2.3 million of those applicants were admitted to these schools, which is about 59%. And then of those, 578,000 ultimately enrolled. So I'll talk a little bit about the methods quickly. So we're looking at our main measure is shares of a particular group's share of the applicant pool, that same group's share of the admit pool and enrollee groups by race and ethnicity. So we want to really focus in on whether those shares are changing in different ways over time. So for example, if one group has an increase in applications, but their shares of admitted students are decreasing, that could be an indication that there's something going on that is unique to that group or a subset of groups. These results are student weighted that will show, but when we look at institution weighted results, these that we get pretty similar numbers. And then we're going to separate selectivity into two groups. Like I said, we had those 6 institutions with an acceptance rate below 50%. We'd love to get some more of those to be able to do some more disaggregated analysis to be able to see our schools with acceptance rates, for example, below 20% affected differently than the 20 to 50% group or something like that. So it's not totally representative yet, but we're excited to show you some of the initial findings we're seeing, and hopefully we'll be able to get some more schools included in here and be able to have a more representative sample. So if we go ahead to the first chart, this is sort of the style of charts that we're showing in this wave of the analysis, where we have over time the share of the applicant group that Asian students were, the share of the admitted group, and then the share of the enrolled group. So for the first few years of our sample, 2018 to 2021 or so, all 3 of these groups show pretty similar trends. The enrollment after that seems to stay pretty flat, while the admitted and applicant groups are increasing. And then between 2023 and 2024, we have this slight decrease in the share of applicants who are Asian, but the share of admitted students, we see a slight increase. Overall, you can kind of see with the enrollment numbers, it kind of evens out in terms of enrollment. And I think this is a good example of where you can see that if you're only looking at enrollment numbers for how you want to potentially assess the impact of all these things that Brian talked about, you might be missing some of the things that are happening behind the scenes with applications and admissions decisions. So this is not anything we want to say is a definite trend, but as we collect data for 2025 and beyond, it'll definitely be interesting to see if this continues, if we see kind of a return to the trend that we were looking at in 2021, 2022, or if it changes in some other way. And so if we go to the next chart, and here we're going to still be looking at Asian students, but within Asian students, we're looking at gender. And the way to kind of interpret this chart is the 0 is 50% women, 50% men. So we're looking at the share of women within Asian students relative to 50%. So if you look at the solid blue line on the left, that would mean in 2018, about 52% of Asian applicants were women. And these dotted lines that we have are specifically those institutions with acceptance rates below 50%, the more selective ones. Overall, most groups are going to see similar gender differences in that more of the applicants and admits are women, And then at selective institutions, even a higher percentage are women. And one of the interesting findings about this particular chart is, if you remember, when we looked just at overall Asian students, we saw this increase in admitted students and a decrease in applications. But when we look at the selective institutions, we see an increase in the share of Asian applications who are women and a decrease in the share of admitted students who are women. So again, something that could potentially indicate, whether that overall trend is driven by men or women or both, and something that we'll want to definitely keep an eye on in future years and with with a larger sample to see if this is something that's just a little bit of noise in the data, or if this is a trend that might need some attention. And then, so if we move on and look at what the admissions process over the last few years has looked like for Black students. Initially, we see that applicants are holding pretty constant over the first few years. Black students are representing a larger share, however, of the admitted group up until about 2021. And then between 2023 and 2024, there's a slight increase in the share of overall applications who are Black students. And it's not a huge increase, but it is the biggest change in any single year we have in this group. And in the same year, the admitted student group had the same share or even a little bit fewer Black students. This is another situation where the enrollment numbers aren't really telling you everything that's going on, because we actually do see this very slight increase in the share of enrolled students who are Black. But it's not as big as the increase that we're seeing in the share of applications. Last thing to point out about this chart is just overall, Black students are highly underrepresented in the admitted student group relative to the applicant pool. This is one of the bigger gaps that we'll see in any of our racial or ethnic groups. And another situation where it'll be interesting to see what happens with the 2025 cycle, and see if this is a trend that continues and is something that is potentially affected by the Supreme Court decision or anti-DEI legislation or anything like that. Or if we see institutions responding in ways that affect this trend. So if we go ahead and look at the selectivity differences for Black students, we're seeing that these trends are even more pronounced at selective institutions. So these blue and yellow lines here for applicants and admits, the solid lines are the same as we saw on the last slide, but the dotted lines are the more selective schools. And we're seeing a pretty similar trend with applicants, although a higher share slightly overall of applicants were Black. But when we look at the admitted students, we see more of a decrease in 2024 of the share of admitted students who are Black. And so the applicant and admitted groups are diverging a little bit more so than they are when we include every institution in the sample. So the next group we're going to look at is Hispanic students. When we look at the overall trends here, we see a small increase for all three of these groups: applicants, admits, and enrollees. And overall, these three groups are a lot closer in representation than we see for some other races, closer than we saw on the last slide for Black students. But we're still looking at Hispanic students being a little underrepresented in the admitted student group relative to the applicant pool. In 2020, between 2023 and 2024, we see this increase in applications and enrollment relative to the overall student population, but we see a leveling off a little bit of the admitted students. So this is another potential indicator that there might be something within FAFSA or the Supreme Court case or anti-DEI legislation that's affecting these trends, and we'll definitely be looking to see if that's something that continues next year. So one of the differences we see when we look by gender for Hispanic students is we see this no clear gap in between overall our overall numbers and our more selective numbers. So most groups tend to have more women applying and being admitted at the more selective schools. Reminder, this is back to a chart where we're looking at the share of women relative to 50% just for Hispanic students. And here we don't really see that big difference. We see a slight increase over time in the share who are women, but we don't see a big difference between selective and the more selective and less selective schools. So if we move ahead and look at white students, we've got all three groups showing pretty consistent trends here. They're a decreasing share of the applicant pool, admitted student group, and enrollees. And they're the only group that's overrepresented in the admitted students relative to applicants. This gap is between 7 to 9 percentage points, depending on which year you look at, but it's pretty consistent over time. And it's also consistent at selective institutions. So when we look at this group as a whole, we're seeing about 48 or 49% of applicants are white, but more like 57% of admitted students are white in 2018. And then that drops to about 41% of applicants in 2024 and 48% of admitted students in 2024. But if we look at selective schools on the next slide, we'll see that overall, white students are a lower share of applications at these more selective institutions with acceptance rates below 50%. But we have the same overrepresentation of admitted students relative to applicants. And it's a similar gap. So the next group I want to talk about a little bit is the group of students who are in the other or unknown race group. This group grew significantly between 2023 and 2024. In the 5 years prior to that, we see a pretty steady trend, a little bit of movement year to year, but nothing significant. And then 2023 to 2024, in applicants, we see about 3% of applicants not disclosing their race or ethnicity, jumping up to about 5%. So we're looking at more than a 50% increase in the applicant group. And you can come up with potential ideas around why a Supreme Court case on affirmative action or a problematic FAFSA rollout or anti-DEI legislation could be playing into more students not just disclosing their race or being in this other unknown race group. And then on the next slide, we'll see that this trend seems to be driven almost entirely by the more selective institutions. So these dotted lines are the more selective institutions. And in 2023, we had about 2% of applicants at these institutions that were in the unknown race group, and we're in 2024 up to about 5.5%. So whereas we had over a 50% increase overall, we're over a 100% increase for the more selective institutions. So this is also something we'll want to keep an eye on to see if this keeps growing. If this is something that's maybe more students are going to be falling into this group, or if it's going to level off, or if there might be some reason that it could return back to a lower level. So definitely something we'll keep an eye on for 2025 data. If we go to the next slide for international students, we looked a little bit at how international student representation has been compared to pre-COVID levels. And we see this like dip in during the pandemic, as you would expect in international student enrollment and admissions. And then after 2021, there's a pretty steady increase in applicants and admits. And to the point where both of those groups are now at a higher level than they were pre-COVID. Overall, international students are underrepresented in the admitted group relative to applications. And this is another group that, because of all of the things Brian mentioned at the beginning of this, we'll want to be keeping an eye on to see if this trend could potentially continue or level off, or if there's going to be another dip in these applications in the future. And then the last chart I'll show is looking at the gender breakdown of international applicants and admits. And I want to show this mainly because it's the one group that has fewer women than men in their applicant and admit pools. So when we look at the share that are women relative to 50%, we are in the negatives for all of these groups listed here. So overall, we're seeing about in 2018, we're seeing about 42% of international applicants were women, and it's dropped a little bit to about 41% in 2024. But this is still the same trend we're seeing in other groups, in that there are more women applying to select the more selective institutions than less selective. So in 2018, that was about 46%, and it stayed relatively constant with a little noise in the data over those 6 years. So for our next steps in the analysis, we are adding data from additional institutions, as Brian talked about, and looking for more participants as well to try and get as robust of a sample as we can. Like I said, we want to be able to have a more representative sample and do more disaggregation with our data so that we can see things like how schools that were in states that had prior affirmative action bans might have differed, or how some of the most selective institutions with very low acceptance rates might be different from the more moderately selective institutions. We also want to analyze whether the admissions look different when we control for things like that. And then we also want to be able to analyze trends for transfer students. For transfer students, we want to look at we want to look at all of these same things. We have data on race and gender, and we want to be able to see if these trends are looking similar for them as to what they are looking like for first-year students. And with that, I'll pass it back to Brian to talk a little bit more about the next phase of the project.
Thanks, Jason. So, as Jason pointed out, despite the limited sample, there were a few things that really jumped out from some of this preliminary analysis. One being that looking only at enrollment data misses a lot of what's happening in the applicant and admit pools. And as most of you will recall, this fall, with the first entering class post the Supreme Court ruling, there was a lot of focus on what the enrollment numbers look like. with a lot of confusion because some schools saw decreases in underrepresented racial groups and other institutions remained flat, and some even saw increases. But all of that misses and is likely a result of some of the things that were happening within the applicant and admit pools. And so having this data is critical to understanding not just enrollment, but the entire admissions process. And while the some of the patterns in changes were more pronounced at the more selective institution, there certainly appear to be shifting patterns among applicants and admits across all selectivity levels. So all the things that we're seeing are not limited just to the highly selective institutions. And then finally, with the potential for a travel ban and also loss of NIH and NSF funding, we could potentially see impacts on the international student enrollment that might parallel what we saw with the pandemic or even worse. And so it'll be important to see how the applicant and admit information around international students changes as a result of some of the policies and practices under the current administration. So next, I will just briefly share some of the things that we have coming up. As Jason mentioned, we're going to continue recruiting schools, working with UERU to get more schools and working with USU and APLU to try and bring more schools into the project. CERPP is, again, partnering with NACAC, and they will be filling a survey sometime in the next few weeks. So if you happen to be a NACAC member, you will likely be seeing this survey in the next couple weeks. We're also planning to have a convening of all the participating schools, one potentially in the fall in conjunction with NACAC's annual meeting, where we'll share additional findings as well as discuss a future research agenda around college admissions. And then we also plan to have a meeting as a pre-conference to the CERPP meeting in winter 2026, I think in February 2026. And with that, I want to, also we will continue collecting applicant admin and enrollee data for the 25-26 entering class. So all the information Jason presented was for the 23-24 admission cycle. Now we're going to be collecting for the current cycle of students coming in for the 25-26 entering class. And now I want to turn it over to Julia Michaels to share why this project is important to UERU and how they're using it to engage with their members. So, Julia?
Sure, thanks, Brian. And hello, everyone. Julia Michaels with UERU and formerly of USU and APLU for many years. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a quick form about a UERU-led community on exploring the future of college admissions. And I'd love to get those of you who are on the webinar today and those of you who may be watching this later, get your input on that community and what it could tackle in terms of, thinking towards the future. So just a little bit about UERU. We're a national membership association with 130 university members. All are R1 or R2 research university members. That's really core to our identity as research institutions. We're very much of the university. So we're based at Colorado State University, though we are national and have members everywhere. And we work primarily with vice provosts for undergraduate education. So those who are individual leaders who are deeply committed to the success of undergraduate students. This project is really important to UERU, not just because of the data that's collected, but because of our mission to improve access and excellence in undergraduate education. And that really does include admissions and affordability as part of accessing a college education for everyone. We published or sponsored the Boyer 2030 report, which some of you may have heard of, and that articulated a bold agenda for transforming undergraduate education at research universities and included making college more affordable and more accessible. So as we work to enact that agenda and implement the recommendations from the Boyer 2030 report, we're going to be looking at how does admissions play a role in particularly strategic enrollment management as well in determining how we improve equity and and excellence in undergraduate education. So this is an area where we're really strong. We do have a number of communities of practice already through our platform and with our members. We'd like to create a community around this work now that we have the data. The data is a great input. We have some initial conclusions, as Brian mentioned. So now that we've drawn those conclusions, how do we respond as a community? So we envisioned that this community would work through different policy options, provide a place for you to strategize with your peers. And if you're interested, we'd love to hear from you and get your ideas for what that community could tackle. I'm open to hearing from both UERU members and those who aren't members, so feel free to contribute via the forum. And we'll, definitely share more information as we start to build this out. But we really see this data collection and the study as a first step towards engaging the community around improving the admissions process in this new environment that we find ourselves in. Brian, back to you.
Thanks, Julia. And so with that concludes our presentation on this project. For anyone who is interested in learning more or potentially participating, please email us at admissionsresearch@urban.org, or you can certainly get in touch with us through Jennifer and USU, as well as the link that Julia just put into the chat. But we're certainly encouraged by the schools who have expressed interest and are currently participating. And we think that this is going to be incredibly important work to really understand how the changing landscape of higher education is really impacting the demographics of who's applying, getting admitted to, and ultimately enrolling in colleges and universities. And so with that, if there are any questions, we're happy to entertain those now. Otherwise, if not, again, please contact us through any of the emails or through USU staff, and we're happy to entertain questions then as well.
Brian and Julia and Jason, I have a question. As a national organization, we have member campuses in all states with very different policy environments around DEI. And you've given us a lot of information to think about. If I am representing an institution in a state that has a maybe sort of stricter stance or more conservative stance on DEI, how would I go about working with these data? What would you suggest, given that you also work with other institutions? Where are you seeing success with institutions that maybe are contextualized in those spaces? And I know that's a much bigger question than the data, but I know you're doing this so people use it. And I'm just wondering if you have any insight out as to how people could use it, regardless or sometimes in spite of the environment that they find themselves in terms of state policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the way that we envision this, and Jason alluded to it when he was talking about the data, is that as we get more schools participating, we're able to do greater disaggregations and ultimately provide institutions a report of their school relative to peers and some of the national information. And so while they might be in a conservative state where they're very limited in some of the activities that they can engage in, they would at least have some indication of how they're performing on some of these measures relative to peers, likely in other states. And so whether or not that would resonate with institutional leaders or state policymakers is certainly unclear, but it may also help inform some of their practices as it pertains to admissions policies and whatnot that they may want to potentially change. The other thing that we're hoping to do is, beyond sort of the data collection piece, is to work more closely with individual colleges and universities who may want to do in-depth follow-up analysis. And so that, we're happy to work with schools on a one-on-one basis or a small group who might want to delve into getting into student level data to really understand and unpack some of the policies and practices they've implemented and whether or not they're effective, and to use an organization like Urban that is a strong research intensive organization to help understand how some of those practices are performing relative to other institutions.
I just have the comment also that this is so important, especially given that we're a little unsure about how some of these national data sets will continue. So this work about trends is so telling, because while you don't necessarily know where it's going to go, it gives you an indication of where things might go. And you have all pointed out some things that could change that. But in data, and especially some of these national data sets, is challenging in terms of our access to them and their maintenance. So this is really critical, I think, for us to have some indication of where these issues might head and where these trends might go. I think trends data is often vastly underutilized and underappreciated for what it can tell you. It won't predict anything, but it certainly gives you information that you can then use.
Yeah, and as mentioned previously, even if um, the changes to iPads do go into effect this fall, um, they'll essentially be setting uh, a baseline that is post a lot of these activities for what the demographics of applicants, admits, and enrollees look like. So we won't really understand, sort of the pre and post COVID environment. We won't understand the impacts of the Supreme Court ruling or the FAFSA rollout or sort of the emergence of all of these state level anti-DEI efforts, and in fact might even miss some of the impacts that the current policies that the administration is implementing. And so it will be great and certainly will be applauded among a lot of people in the research community if in fact those data do get added to iPads. But the reality is we won't really have a true understanding of how much has changed just in the past 5 or 6 years.
And then I'm just going to take another license of the question that I'd love each of you to answer. As one data nerd to another, when you do these things, I'm putting you in the nerd herd here, sorry, but when you do these things, there's always a finding that kind of captures your attention as a researcher, like something that surprises you or you ruminate over. You've given us so much to think about. I wonder if each of you could talk about a particular finding or angle of these data that you're still thinking about, or that surprised you, or that you're really excited to delve into deeper.
I'll let Jason or Julia go first this time.
Yeah, I can start. I think for me, one of the big questions is like one of the first examples we showed was seeing that the share of applications from Asian students was down in 2024 compared to 2023. And the thing that type of finding and that similar findings like that for other groups I am most curious about, and I'm hoping we can eventually have data to answer some of this, is that individual applicants changing their own behavior and how many schools they're applying to because of whatever they feel their chances of getting into a certain place might be, or for any other reason? Or are we looking at like just more students applying in general? Are we looking at a higher share of the Asian population or a lower share of the Asian population applying to college? Or are we looking at individual students submitting fewer applications? Or are we looking at something that's just reflective of population change in general? So that's one of the things that I am super interested in and would love to learn more about.
I'll sort of chime in. One of the findings from this that I think has been echoed elsewhere is the growth in race, ethnicity unknown, and sort of that being a function of how individuals perceive how they'll be viewed in the admissions process, and that they may not want to share or disclose their race or ethnicity, even though there's plenty of information for them that this is not used in the process, right? And for schools that are not using race and ethnicity in the admissions process, and yet we see this huge jump after 2023. So I'm just kind of curious, like from a psychological perspective, like how students are interpreting these changes in the environment and how that changes their behavior, and also just sort of like how we're defining this. And maybe it's becoming less important for students to identify a certain way. So that's something that's been percolating for me.
Yeah, and for me, I think something that even coming into this project was top of mind, and some of the preliminary findings have just reinforced my curiosity, is that, at the outset, we were focused on the Supreme Court ruling, not knowing that we were going to have the significant expansion of anti-DEI efforts and issues with the rollout of the FAFSA. But one of the things that we heard from a lot of potential participating schools was that they weren't very selective, and so they didn't think the Supreme Court ruling would have any impact on their applicant, admit demographics. And there was research around Prop 29 in California that actually showed some of the less selective UC schools did see dramatic shifts because they saw a lot of the more academically prepared students who would have applied to UCLA or Berkeley now applying to their institutions. And so we wanted to find something similar, or if that was happening as a result of the Supreme Court ruling. But when you layer in the issues with the FAFSA and the state anti-DEI legislation that's potentially impacting out-of-state students who may now not want to go into certain states, one of the things that we're seeing is that we're seeing demographic shifts among the applicant and admit pool, regardless of selectivity. It is certainly more pronounced in the more selective institutions for particular groups, but every institution is experiencing some type of shift, which might suggest that when you start thinking about the confluence of all of these things, we are really looking at a massive sort of shifting in decisions that certain types of students are making about where they want to spend 4, 5, 6 years of their life. And so absent any national data right now to study that, and the likelihood that even if we get that data, we're not going to be able to truly understand the trends going back to pre-COVID. I think that that's fascinating and something that a lot of institutions should really be focused on, that this is not an issue just of highly selective institutions, that all of the things that are occurring right now are beginning to shift where certain groups of students are choosing to apply and where they're ultimately getting admitted to.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think what all three of these, things that you shared illustrate is that the admissions and application process is very complex, and it's layered sociologically and psychologically. So we tend to rely on heuristics and old rules. And what you're doing is giving us data to basically interrogate some of those assumptions and unpack them, and for a current modern era, and to prepare us for some new changes that might be coming down the pike. So I just want to thank you so much from USU for opening up this project to us, these data, to making it available. If people, I want to remind everybody that you can participate in this, and that to reach out to me through USU, or to Brian and Jason at the Urban Institute, or to Julia Michaels at UERU if you have interest in this project. So thank you again for your time. Thank everybody for participating today and for future viewing. And we look forward to hearing the next stages of this project and how people are going to be using this information. Thanks again and have a great day.